This is a brief lecture, and I mean very brief this week, to cover the readings that are assigned for week 14 in MCOM 5350. Specifically, you're assigned to read chapters 7 and 8 for this week, and I want to point out that was a little bit of a mistake in the syllabus, which had chapter 6, but really it was supposed to be chapter 7 and 8. So hopefully you watch this lecture before you do the readings. I'd like to start today with a story. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. After that opening slide, you might be scratching your head and wondering, what in the world is the connection to the content of this course? Well, I wanted to catch your attention with a story, since storytelling is the focus of this week's readings, and it is something we have been reflecting on a lot for these last few weeks. I chose this passage from Genesis because it's a great story and one that most of you are likely familiar with. And by the way, it happens to be the epilogue to my book. I used it, even though my book really doesn't have anything to do with Adam and Eve, I used it as a story at the beginning of the book's preface to catch the reader's attention and draw them in and start thinking in a more concrete way about some of the gender differences and stories that are told in scientific discourse that are covered in my book on the history of the concept of female hormones. So anyway, does this passage have anything to do with this week's readings? Probably not. Not at all in terms of subject matter. But I got your attention, didn't I? And with that accomplished, I'd like to invite you to reflect for a moment on the question that's indicated in this slide. Why are stories so powerful? There is actually scientific research that suggests why stories are effective as a communication tool. I'm not a neuroscientist, but this is something I've read about lately and I find it fascinating. Basically, when a person is presented with a list of facts or data points or bullet points, it activates one specific part of the brain, the part that is responsible for translating words into meaning. By contrast, when a person hears a good story, many parts of the brain can become activated. In fact, when storytelling is at its most effective, the listener's brain becomes activated in the same way as the storyteller's brain. I will provide a link in Blackboard to the article where I recently read about this, and hopefully you'll find it as interesting as I do. In the readings for this week, we consider how to harness this power of stories in the context of workplace presentations. On this slide, I'm showing an example that is used in chapter 8. This is an extended example that the author examines step by step throughout the chapter, but I think this slide captures very clearly and succinctly how we can conceive the story that underlies a particular presentation. Of course, this technique can also apply to a report, such as the ones you're writing in this class. Once you have this underlying structure for the story that you want to tell, then you make all of your design and content decisions in accordance with this storytelling goal. So this slide quickly summarizes some of the key points offered in Chapter 7 for how to tell an effective story in a workplace presentation or report. I think this advice is very relevant to the work you all are doing right now in the final phases of preparing your capstone presentations and reports. In terms of structure, I know it seems obvious that a good story has a beginning, middle, and end, but I encourage you to think about how this applies to the context of a report or presentation in the workplace. For the second item, elements, Hopefully, you've learned some skills this semester that will help you make each of these elements effective. We've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks on data visualizations. Of course, you also need to pay attention to the language you are using. In any workplace document, assume your audience is busy and distracted, so think about the kind of language that will grab their attention. You don't need to be fancy or overly complex. Rather, your audience will much prefer language that is concrete, simple, bold, and direct. Finally, always consider your audience. Imagine yourself in their shoes. What information do they need to know first? Give them that information first so they can understand the story you're going to tell. But don't get sidetracked and end up providing way too much background information so they lose track of your main story. And that's it for this week's lecture. I wish you all happy endings for the semester in this class as well as any other classes and endeavors you're undertaking right now. And I hope this little bit of advice about storytelling is kind of a nice way to move into these last phases of your capstone presentation and report. I have viewed all of your presentations, and you're going to see that I want to schedule a phone call with each of you in the coming weeks to go over some feedback that I have on those. I really hope that at this point in the semester you're feeling like you have a solid draft of the report and a solid draft of the presentation, so you can use these last couple weeks in the semester to just refine the story that you want to tell in each of those documents. It's been a great semester. I've really enjoyed working with all of you, and I look forward to talking to each of you in these next couple weeks as we wrap things up. Thanks.